Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 7. This week, we're going to be talking about social problems related to crime. So, we're going to introduce a lot of concepts this week, some of which maybe you're familiar with, others perhaps you've heard throughout the media but don't necessarily know what they refer to. So, we're going to be introducing several of those concepts this week. Things like mass incarceration, the privatization of prisons, the prison industrial complex, defunding and abolishing the police. So lots of really popular topics in everyday discussions, especially coming out of 2020. We had, as we talked a little bit about last week when we were discussing social problems pertaining to race, 2020 was really a pivotal year in our history about increasing public perception and understanding about various social problems related to our criminal justice system in the United States. Of course, a lot of this was an extension of the Black Lives Matter movement, the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other people of color at the hands of police. And so as we have these discussions today, as always, whenever we're thinking about any social problem, we need to be thinking about them with the sociological imagination and understand how the intersections of several different social structures in our society often contribute to these problems, making them really difficult to address and sometimes really difficult to come up with solutions to because they're embedded within so many different social structures in our society here in the US. So let me go ahead and walk through the different pieces of content I'm asking you to either read or watch this week. So in the week 7 content folder, you'll see your typical week 7 to-do list. Nothing fancy this week other than to just watch the content, complete your weekly discussion EOP, and your weekly discussion comments. So this first reading here is titled Why the Texas Police Stop Video is a Problem. So this just is a reading that goes over a policy in Texas to educate high school students about how to interact with police officers when being pulled over. But this video, some argue, is problematic because it places a lot of blame on us as individuals rather than correcting problems at the systems level. And remember, in sociology, especially in the study of social problems, we don't want to blame individuals, we want to blame the system. We want to find out what are the problems in the larger structures in society that make it difficult for individuals to operate on their day-to-day lives. So that's what this first reading gets at. The next reading, after Ferguson, Black men still face the highest rate of being killed by police. So again, a lot of our discussions about problems in crime that we'll talk about this week are intersectional problems that have a lot to do with social class, have a lot to do with race and racism in the United States. And this is just one particular reading that goes over some research that has found that there's still a lot of inherent racial bias in our police system in the US today. Next reading, killings by police declined after Black Lives Matter protest. So I'm also trying to incorporate not all just doom and gloom in our readings here. It's important to understand the social problems that we're discussing and why they exist, but it's also equally, if not more important, to recognize things that we're doing, efforts of social change and mobilization that are actually resulting in solving or helping to reduce some of these social problems. So this is a reading that reports findings from a recent study that found that in cities where Black Lives Matter protests took place, there's actually been a decrease in killings by police and a few other positive outcomes from these Black Lives Matter protests. I also included a short little reading here about why people loot. In summer of 2020, I think a lot of the most contentious debate I saw on Facebook was centered around individuals who maybe were supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, supportive of the peaceful protests that were taking place, but didn't understand why looting in some of these more violent riots broke out in certain cities throughout the United States. And so I think this reading does a good job providing kind of a sociological perspective, explaining what motivates people who chose to loot or to engage in violent riots. And again, I think it's always important that we approach these discussions from multiple perspectives, so that's why I included that particular reading this week. I then have a reading called Masked Racism, Reflections on the Prison Industrial Complex, and this is by Angela Davis, one of the most well-known and respected scholars studying race and racism and the implications that it has on our criminal justice system in the United States. So Dr. Davis does a wonderful job explaining these connections between racism as being a form of modern-day slavery and its connections to the prison industrial complex in our society today. Then included another reading here that equates our current prison complex industry in the United States to slavery. So it's really interesting to read some of this data here about how imprisoned people are treated and to read about these arguments that kind of extend and in my opinion, do a fairly good job establishing the argument that our prison system in the United States was actually developed as a way to maintain slavery. So really interesting stuff there. Then include just a short video that talks about private prisons and the privatization of prisons in the United States today. Our current government is working towards abolishing private prisons, so that is something to keep in mind as you're reading through this content and the implications that might have. And then I'm also asking you to watch a feature-length documentary this week called 13th. I believe it's still available to stream on Netflix, but it's also available free for any individual to watch online, so that's the link you'll find here. It's a really brilliant documentary that kind of provides the history behind prison culture in the United States today. And again, another great resource in establishing this connection between slavery and prisons as being a form of modern day slavery in the United States. So if you haven't watched this already, I would definitely recommend taking an hour and a half to watch this. It's one of the most impactful documentaries that I've ever seen, and I think it's something that will be very informative in our discussions this week. And then these last few readings here have to do with defunding the police. This is another really contentious discussion that arose into public discourse after Black Lives Matter protests this summer, and I don't think a lot of people really understand what's meant when they hear defunding the police, or alternatively abolishing the police. So there's kind of two different strategies here, one to defund, one to abolish. Some people use them interchangeably. I understand them as being two different approaches, but there is already starting to be some evidence that defunding the police can actually reduce killings by police, can reduce incarcerations. And so there's a reading here about Denver, Colorado, who's successfully been defunding the police to fund mental health professionals, to actually send mental health professionals out to nonviolent 911 calls. And as a result, arrests and killings by police were actually decreasing in Denver over the past 6 months. Then, of course, I have my video lectures for this week where I kind of explain all of these different readings and topics that I've introduced in this video, and the slides are provided down here as well. So again, as we continue to lean into these uncomfortable discussions about contentious social problems in the United States, please keep an open mind. Always think like a sociologist. Be willing to go up in your hot air balloons and get that broader perspective of these topics rather than just having your own personal opinions or biases wash over you. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this content this week. As always, reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns. Take care, everybody.